Miss Marple and the Murder Behind the Bookshop Curtain. Welcome, dear listeners. I'm Ailey, your host from Cafe Tales, and it's such a joy to have you with us tonight. Our cozy mysteries bring together friends from all over the world. Before we begin, I'd love to know, what is your favorite book of all time? Share it with us in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe, as over 80% of our listeners haven't yet, and we bring you new mysteries every single day. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's uncover tonight's story. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead High Street as Miss Jane Marple made her way toward Fow and Son secondhand books. It was the sort of perfect Saturday that brought the entire village out for the weekly shopping, and today there was the added excitement of an author signing. Miss Marple paused before the shop window, noting with approval the careful arrangement of volumes that Mr. Ambrose Fow had displayed for the occasion. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you," called Lady Bantry, approaching with her characteristic brisk stride. "You simply must come in and meet Miss Lane. Such a clever woman, writes the most thrilling murder stories, though I do wonder how she manages to think up such dreadful things." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I find, Dolly, that human nature provides quite enough inspiration for any number of stories, dreadful or otherwise." As they approached the shop entrance, Miss Marple's keen ear caught something odd. The familiar tinkle of Fow's doorbell seemed somehow muffled, almost apologetic in its greeting. She paused for just a moment, her blue eyes taking in the unusual softness of the sound that had welcomed customers to this establishment for the better part of 20 years. Inside the narrow shop buzzed with genteel conversation. The usual Saturday crowd had been swelled by visitors from neighboring villages, eager to meet Miss Coral Lane, whose latest detective novel had been receiving such favorable reviews in the London papers. Ambrose Fow, the proprietor, moved about his domain with quiet satisfaction, his precise manner evident in every carefully dusted shelf and properly aligned spine. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said, approaching with a slight bow. "How good of you to join us. I believe you'll find Miss Lane's work most engaging. Her murders are quite ingenious, though I confess I prefer my violence confined to the printed page." Miss Marple accepted the cup of tea that Edwin Pratt, Fow's diffident assistant, offered, with slightly trembling hands. Poor Edwin always seemed nervous during social gatherings, though he managed the day-to-day business of the shop with quiet competence. "This is indeed a treat, Mr. Fow," she replied, her eyes wandering to the heavy green baize curtain that separated the main shop from the back room. Something about it caught her attention. A fresh linen tape bore that seemed oddly new against the worn fabric. "You've made some improvements, I see." Fow glanced toward the curtain with pride. "Just a small touch. One must maintain proper appearances, mustn't tone. The back room serves as my private office and valuation area. Can't have customers glimpsing the more, shall we say, commercial aspects of the trade." Near the center of the shop, Miss Coral Lane held court behind a small table laden with copies of her latest work. She was a woman of perhaps 40, with lively dark eyes and an animated way of speaking that drew her listeners in. Several villagers clustered around her, including Mrs. Clement, from the vicarage, who was asking earnest questions about the research required for crime writing. "Oh, but you'd be surprised how much one can learn simply by observing." Miss Lane was saying people reveal so much about themselves without realizing it. The way they hold their teacup, how they arrange their belongings, what they choose to notice or ignore. "How perfectly true," murmured Millicent Vale, who had positioned herself slightly apart from the main group. The stern-faced woman served as chair of the village library committee, and her fingers, Miss Marple noted, bore the telltale stains of ink, though it seemed a peculiar shade of green, rather than the usual blue-black. At the far end of the shop, near the rare bookcase, Julian Hazelig examined volumes with the practiced eye of a London dealer. He was a man of perhaps 50, impeccably dressed, and possessed of the sort of easy charm that made people trust him instinctively, sometimes unwisely. His attention seemed particularly focused on a glass case containing what appeared to be a rather special volume, the Kelmscott Chaucer Fow explained to Miss Marple, following her gaze. Mr. Hazeligg has expressed considerable interest. It's quite a prize, though I must confess I'm still researching its provenance thoroughly before any sale. Quite right, said a sharp voice from behind them. Nora Page, a neat widow of middle years, had approached with what could only be described as a determined expression. One must be absolutely certain of values, mustn't tone, Mr. Fow? It would be dreadful if anyone felt they hadn't received fair treatment. There was something pointed in her tone that made several nearby conversations pause momentarily. Fow's face colored slightly, but he maintained his courteous demeanor. Indeed, Mrs. Page, fair dealing is the cornerstone of any reputable establishment. Oh, absolutely, Mrs. Page replied, though her smile seemed somewhat forced. I'm sure you always ensure that both parties understand exactly what they're agreeing to. Miss Marple sensed undercurrents that had nothing to do with the cheerful literary atmosphere of the afternoon. She moved closer to the refreshment table where Dr. Haydock was helping himself to another of Mrs. Clement's excellent biscuits. Quite a turnout, she observed quietly. Indeed, though I suspect some are here for reasons that have little to do with literature, the doctor replied with a meaningful glance toward Hazeligg, who was now engaged in earnest conversation with Fow about the Chaucer volume. Mr. Hazeligg seems very knowledgeable, Miss Marple said diplomatically. Oh, he's knowledgeable enough. Whether his knowledge is always applied to entirely ethical purposes is another matter entirely. But then, the rare. Book trade has always attracted a certain type of character. Their conversation was interrupted by Ambrose Fow moving purposefully toward the green baize curtain. If you'll excuse me for just a moment, he announced to the room in general, I must fetch something rather special for Mr. Hazeligg's consideration. He pushed through the curtain with a rustle of fabric, leaving the gathered company to continue their literary discussions. Miss Marple found herself studying the curtain's movement, noting how the fresh linen tape created a neat bow that contrasted sharply with the worn edges of the baize itself. The conversation flowed around her, a mixture of praise for Miss Lane's latest plot twists and speculation about the weather for the church fete next weekend. Inspector Slack, she noticed, had arrived quietly and was standing near the door with a patient expression of a man fulfilling a social obligation rather than professional duty. It was then, perhaps a minute after Fow had disappeared behind the curtain, that his voice rang out clearly from the back room, slightly muffled but perfectly distinct. One moment, please. Several heads turned toward the sound, and Miss Lane paused mid-sentence in her explanation of how she had devised her latest locked room mystery. Edwin Pratt, who had been refilling the teapot, looked up with a puzzled expression. Then came a sound that was most decidedly not part of any pleasant Saturday afternoon gathering. A sharp intake of breath followed by what could only be described as a crash. Edwin dropped the teapot with a clatter and rushed toward the curtain, pushing through it with uncharacteristic boldness. His cry of distress brought the entire company hurrying forward. Though Miss Marple noticed that she was not the only one who remained where she was, observing rather than participating in the sudden rush toward whatever lay behind that green baize barrier. The pleasant afternoon had taken a most unpleasant turn, pierced the genteel atmosphere of the bookshop like a blade through silk. The assembled company surged forward, though Miss Marple remained precisely where she was, her keen eyes taking note of who moved first, and who, like herself, held back to observe. Julian Hazeligg was among the first to reach the curtain, his London polish temporarily forgotten in the urgency of the moment. Dr. Haydock followed immediately behind, his medical training overriding any social hesitation. Lady Bantry, never one to be left out of any drama, pressed close behind them, while Mrs. Clement clutched her husband's arm with white knuckles. Dear God! Edwin's voice came through the heavy baize, shaking with shock. Mr. Fow! Oh dear God, what's happened? Miss Marple moved forward then, but slowly, her mind already cataloging the sequence of events. They had heard Ambrose Fow's voice, clearly, distinctly, from behind the curtain not 2 minutes before. His words had been perfectly ordinary. "One moment, please." The sort of thing any shopkeeper might say when searching for a particular item or dealing with some minor difficulty. Dr. Haydock had pushed through the curtain now, and his voice came back to them with the crisp authority of medical certainty. "Everyone, please stay back, Mrs. Clement. Perhaps you could see that the ladies are made comfortable." But Miss Coral Lane was having none of that Victorian consideration. "Nonsense," she said briskly. "I've written enough murder scenes to be perfectly capable of viewing one in reality." She pushed through the curtain with determination, and Miss Marple, deciding that discretion had served its purpose, followed quietly behind. The back room of Fow and Son was revealed as a cramped but orderly space, lined with shelves of books awaiting valuation or repair. A heavy table press dominated one corner, its iron wheel gleaming with recent oil. It was beside this formidable piece of equipment that Ambrose Fow lay collapsed, his precise manner sadly absent from his crumpled form. Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, Heiss' experienced hands already checking for signs of life that Miss Marple suspected were long past finding. The proprietor's gray head bore a single darkening bruise at the left temple, and his eyes stared unseeing at the ceiling above. "Is he?" Edwin's voice broke on the question. "I'm afraid so," Dr. Haydock replied gently but firmly. "Has been for some time, I should say." He looked up at Inspector Slack, who had appeared with commendable promptness. "You'll want this room sealed, Inspector. This is no natural death." Miss Marple's eyes swept the scene with the thoroughness of a housewife checking for dust in forgotten corners. The room was tidy, almost obsessively so, with everything in its proper place. Save for one detail that struck her as significant. A stool that normally sat beside the valuation desk had been moved, positioned now near the body with something resting upon it. "But I heard him speak," Edwin said, his voice rising with distress. "Not 3 minutes ago we all heard him." "One moment, please," he said, clear as day. "That's quite right," Miss Coral Lane confirmed with the certainty of someone accustomed to noting details for her fiction. "I heard it distinctly, rather muffled as one would expect from behind that heavy curtain, but definitely Mr. Fow's voice." Several other heads nodded in agreement. Even Millicent Vale, who had remained characteristically stern-faced throughout the discovery, acknowledged hearing the words. Inspector Slack, his notebook already in hand, looked around the assembled group with a suspicious eye of a man who had dealt with too many convenient alibis. "So you're all saying you heard the deceased speaking after he was in fact already dead?" "Well, when you put it like that," Lady Bantry said with a slight shiver, "it does sound rather ghostly, doesn't it?" Miss Marple moved closer to the stool, her sharp eyes taking in the object that rested upon it. It was a doorstop, she realized, fashioned to look like a gilt-edged book, and heavy enough to serve its purpose admirably. Heavy enough, she reflected, to do considerably more than stop a door if wielded with sufficient force. "Edwin," she said quietly to the distressed assistant, "when did Mr. Fow last go into this room today?" "Not since early morning, Miss Marple. He was particular about keeping the shop tidy for the author signing." "Sad customers shouldn't see the working parts of the business." Edwin's hands twisted together in distress. He was so looking forward to today. Said it would bring in customers who appreciated quality books. "And when did he go behind the curtain just now?" Inspector Slack asked, his pencil poised. "Perhaps 5 minutes ago. He said he needed to fetch something special for Mr. Hazelig's consideration." Edwin looked toward the London dealer with something approaching accusation. Hazelig shifted uncomfortably. "I had expressed interest in examining the Kelmscott Chaucer more closely. Fow said he had some additional documentation that might prove its provenance." "What sort of documentation?" Dr. Haydock asked, looking up from his preliminary examination. of the body. Authentication records, previous ownership history, that sort of thing. The rare book trade requires careful documentation, especially for items of such value. Miss Marple had moved to examine the curtain itself, noting again the fresh linen tape that secured it with such a precise bow. Something about that newness troubled her, as did the particular way the heavy baize fell in such neat folds. "Inspector," she said quietly, "might I suggest you examine this room very carefully before anyone else enters? I have the distinct feeling that what we're seeing may not be quite what it appears." Slack, who had learned over the years to respect Miss Marple's observations, nodded grimly. "Right then. Everyone out except Dr. Haydock. This is now a crime scene, and I'll need statements from all of you." As the group filed back through the curtain into the main shop, Miss Marple lingered for just a moment longer. Her eyes swept the back room once more, taking in details that might prove significant later. The position of the body, the moved stool, the precise arrangement of everything else. But it was something she couldn't quite see that troubled her most. The voice they had all heard so clear and distinct, speaking words that seemed perfectly natural for a man searching through his stock. Yet Dr. Haydock's preliminary examination suggested that Ambrose Fow had been dead for considerably longer than the few minutes since they'd heard that voice. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack's voice held a note of impatience. "Of course, Inspector. I was just thinking how very convenient it was that we all heard Mr. Fow speak when we did. Almost as if someone wanted to ensure we knew he was alive at that particular moment." She followed the others back into the main shop where Edwin was attempting to serve tea with hands that shook so badly the cups rattled against their saucers. The Uther signing that had begun with such promise had become something far more sinister, and Miss Marple suspected that before this matter was resolved, several of her fellow villagers would find themselves exposed to scrutiny they would prefer to avoid. The pleasant Saturday afternoon had indeed taken a most unpleasant turn, and she had the distinct feeling that the worst revelations were yet to come. Chapter 3. Soft Bell. While Lady Bantry took charge. Chapter 3. Soft Bell off shepherding the more distressed members of the company toward the comfort of the refreshment table, Miss Marple found herself drawn back toward the shop entrance. The oddly muffled sound of the doorbell continued to trouble her, and she had learned over the years that seemingly insignificant details often prove to be the most illuminating. "Such a dreadful business," Mrs. Clement was saying, her voice barely above a whisper. "Poor Mr. Fow, and to think we were all here, enjoying ourselves while he was lying there." Now," Dr. Haydock said with professional kindness, having emerged from the sealed back room with a grave expression. "There was nothing any of us could have done. Death appears to have been instantaneous." Miss Marple examined the door mechanism with the thoroughness of someone checking the locks before retiring for the night. The familiar brass bell that had announced customers to Fow & Son for decades hung from its customary hook, but something was distinctly different about it today. "How curious," she murmured, leaning closer to examine the bell's spring fork. A loop of fine thread had been wrapped around it, so delicate that it was nearly invisible, unless one looked directly for it. The thread seemed to muffle the bell's natural resonance, explaining the unusually soft chime that had caught her attention upon arrival. "Miss Marple," Inspector Slack called from across the shop. "I'll need to speak with each of you separately. Perhaps we could use the vicar's study." "Of course, Inspector," Reverend Clement replied, "though I confess I'm rather shaken by all this. Ambrose was such a methodical man. It's difficult to imagine how he could have met with an accident in his own shop." "Who said anything about an accident?" Slack replied grimly. Miss Marple moved away from the door, her mind already working through the implications of the muffled bell. If someone had deliberately dulled its sound, they must have had a reason for wanting arrivals and departures to go unnoticed. But by whom and when? The green baize curtain drew her attention once more, while Inspector Slack was occupied with organizing interviews. She took the opportunity to examine it more closely. The heavy fabric had been hung with care, and that fresh, linen tape bow seemed almost theatrical in its precision, but it was what lay behind the curtain, barely visible from the main shop, that made her pause. In the narrow gap between curtain and floor, she could glimpse something that definitely hadn't been there during her previous visits to Foe and Son, a gramophone. The machine sat on a small table near the back wall, its brass horn gleaming despite the room's dimness. What struck Miss Marple as particularly interesting was that the gramophone appeared to be recently used. A record lay upon the turntable, and the needle arm was positioned not at the beginning but partway across the disc, as if it had been playing, and then stopped mid-performance. More intriguing still was a detail that would have escaped a less observant eye. The brake lever had what appeared to be a thread attached to it, so fine that it might have been a spider's web, save for its obvious deliberate placement. Fascinating machine, isn't it? Julian Hazelig had approached quietly, his dealer's eye, taking in her examination of the gramophone, though I must say it seems an odd addition to a book valuation room. Indeed, Miss Marple replied thoughtfully. Mr. Hazelig, you've had dealings with Mr. Fow before, haven't you? Several times over the years he had an excellent eye for quality, though perhaps a bit too scrupulous for some tastes. The book trade requires a certain flexibility in one's approach to valuation. How do you mean? Hazelig glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard, then lowered his voice. Fow was the sort who would spend weeks researching a single volume's provenance before setting a price. Admirable in principle, but it could slow business considerably. Some dealers prefer to trust their instincts and move inventory more quickly. Miss Marple nodded politely, but her attention was still fixed on the gramophone. I wonder, she said casually, when Mr. Fow acquired that machine. It seems rather modern for someone of his traditional tastes. Can't say I'd noticed it before, Hazelig admitted, though I suppose even the most conservative of us must bow to progress eventually. Edwin Pratt, who had been listening to their conversation while mechanically arranging and rearranging the tea service, looked up with red-rimmed eyes. The gramophone. Mr. Fow didn't care for such things. Miss said music was a distraction when one was trying to concentrate on proper valuations. But it's clearly been used recently, Miss Marple observed. Not today. I'm certain of that, Edwin replied firmly. Mr. Fow was quite particular about noise when customers were present. Said it wasn't professional. This information added another layer to the puzzle forming in Miss Marple's mind. A gramophone that hadn't been played today yet showed clear signs of recent use. A record positioned midway through its performance. A brake lever with a thread attached. And all of this in a room where the proprietor had been found dead after they had all distinctly heard his voice. She moved closer to examine the record itself, noting with interest that someone had written on the label in pencil. The handwriting was Edwin's familiar scrawl. Coral Lane, Side A, Miss Lane, she called softly to the crime novelist, who was engaged in animated discussion with Dr. Haydock about the various ways one might inflict a fatal head wound. Might I have a word? Coral Lane approached with the brisk efficiency that had made her mystery novel so popular. Certainly, Miss Marple. Though I must say, this real-life mystery is proving far more complex than anything I've ever written. I noticed there's a gramophone record with your name on it. Might you know anything about that? Miss Lane peered through the gap in the curtain, hairy brows rising in surprise. Good heavens, yes. I made that recording last month for the parish wireless program. It's a reading from my latest novel. But what on earth is it doing here? You recorded it yourself? Oh yes, at the Wireless Society. Meeting. Several of us made recordings for various local programs. Quite modern of us, don't you think? She paused, studying the machine more closely, though I can't imagine why Mr. Fow would have acquired a copy. He seemed to have little interest in contemporary literature. Miss Marple filed this information away carefully. Our recording of Miss Lane's voice positioned on a gramophone that hadn't been played today according to Edwin, yet clearly showing signs of recent use. And that peculiar thread arrangement that seemed to connect the brake lever to what exactly? Her examination was interrupted by Inspector Slack's return from his initial survey of the crime scene. Right then, he announced to the assembled company, "I'll need detailed statements from each of you. When did you arrive? What did you see? What did you hear? And I particularly want to know about this voice you all claim to have heard from the back room." Claim? Lady Bantry drew herself up with dignity. "Inspector, I may be many things, but I'm not given to imaginary voices. No offense intended, your ladyship, but the medical evidence suggests that Mr. Fow had been dead for some time before you heard this alleged speaking." "How long?" Miss Marple asked quietly. Dr. Haydock consulted his preliminary notes. "Difficult to be precise without a proper examination, but I'd estimate at least 10 minutes before Edwin discovered the body, possibly longer." A murmur of confusion ran through the group. If Ambrose Fow had been dead for 10 minutes or more before Edwin found him, then the voice they had all heard distinctly saying, "One moment, please," belonged to someone else entirely, or something else. Miss Marple glanced once more at the gramophone with its positioned record and thread-attached brake lever, the soft bell with its muffled chime, the fresh linen tape on the curtain. Each detail seemed insignificant on its own, but together they suggested a careful preparation, a deliberate staging of events. Someone had wanted them all to believe that Ambrose Fow was alive at a particular moment when he was in fact already dead. The question was who, and more importantly, why. As Inspector Slack began organizing his interviews, Miss Marple settled into a corner chair with her knitting, content to observe and listen. The truth, she felt certain, was hidden somewhere. In the details they had all witnessed, but perhaps not fully understood. The soft bell had been only the beginning. The back room had yielded several items of interest, not least of which were 2 leather-bound ledgers that he now examined with the careful attention of a man who understood that the devil, as they say, often resided in the details. "Most interesting," he murmured, spreading the books open on the counter in the main shop, while the assembled company waited with varying degrees of patience for their individual interviews. "Mr. appears to have kept 2 separate sets of records." Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking softly in the corner, looked up with polite interest. "2 sets, Inspector. How curious indeed. This one," Slack indicated the first ledger, "appears to be his day-to-day shop ledger. Prices noted in his own hand. Very neat, very precise. The sort of thing a customer might see if they inquired about a particular volume's value." Dr. Haydock moved closer to examine the entries. Fow was always meticulous about his record-keeping. Said it was the mark of a professional. "Ah, but then there's the second ledger," Slack continued, opening the more worn of the 2 books. "This appears to be his private buying record, and some of these entries have been, shall we say, modified." The pages showed clear evidence of alterations. Several entries had small pieces of paper pasted over the original writing, while others showed signs of eraser and overwriting. It was the sort of careful modification that suggested someone had been very particular about what information remained visible. "What sort of modifications?" Miss Coral Lane asked. Her novelist curiosity clearly piqued. Slack pointed to a particular entry. "Well, here we have a record of items purchased from Mrs. Page. The original entry appears to have read 30 shillings, but it's been altered to read $3. A sharp intake of breath from the direction of the tea table indicated that Mrs. Page had heard this revelation. She approached the counter with the determined stride of someone prepared to defend herself. "I beg your pardon, Inspector, but there was no alteration involved. Mr. Fow paid me exactly what we agreed upon. And what was that amount, Mrs. Page?" Slack asked mildly. 30 shillings, naturally, for my late husband's collection of books, though I must say I felt it was rather less than their true worth. Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking. 30 shillings, you say? But Inspector Slack just mentioned that the ledger shows $3, which would be 60 shillings, Dr. Haydock added helpfully. The mathematics of the situation seemed to settle over Mrs. Page like a cold draft. That is to say, I'm quite certain we agreed on 30 shillings. Yet the ledger clearly shows $3, Slack observed. Most curious indeed. Edwin Pratt, who had been growing increasingly pale throughout this discussion, spoke up with a trembling voice. Perhaps there was some mistake in the recording. Mr. Fow was very particular about accuracy, but even the most careful person can make errors. Miss Marple found this explanation less than satisfactory. In her experience, Ambrose Fow had been the sort of man who checked his arithmetic twice and counted his change 3 times. The idea that he would make such a significant error in recording seemed highly unlikely. But there were other entries in the private ledger that proved even more intriguing. Slack had found a section devoted to what appeared to be library transactions marked with the heading Library Withdrawals in Fow's precise script. Now, this is particularly interesting, the inspector continued. It appears that Mr. Fow had some sort of arrangement with the local library. Several valuable items are listed as being withdrawn, including Pause to read more carefully, a Kelmscott Bible, and something called a Kelmscott Chaucer marked on approval. Millicent Vale, who had maintained her characteristic stern silence throughout most of the proceedings, suddenly stiffened. I'm sure I don't know what you mean by arrangement, Inspector. The Library Committee's dealings with local book dealers are conducted according to proper procedures. I'm sure they are, Miss Vale, but perhaps you could explain what on approval might mean in this context. Miss Vale's fingers, Miss Marple noted, seemed to betray a slight tremor as she adjusted her spectacles. On approval simply means that items are being evaluated for potential purchase or sale. All quite routine, I assure you, and these evaluations would be committee decisions, I suppose. Naturally, the Library Committee takes its responsibilities very seriously. Miss Marple observed that Miss Vale's responses had the careful quality of someone choosing her words with particular attention to their legal implications. It was the sort of precision that often indicated there was more to the story than was being immediately revealed. But what caught Miss Marple's attention even more than the verbal sparring was a small but significant detail. As Miss Vale had spoken, she had unconsciously rubbed her fingers together, and Miss Marple could swear she caught a glimpse of green staining on the fingertips. Not the usual blue-black of ordinary ink, but a distinctive green that seemed oddly familiar. Inspector Slack had moved on to examine other entries in the ledgers, but Miss Marple found herself thinking about that particular shade of green. Where had she seen it before? The color seemed to trigger a memory, though she couldn't quite place. "It, Inspector," she said quietly. "Might I suggest you examine Mr. Fow's clothing as well? Sometimes the smallest details prove most illuminating." Slack looked up from the ledgers with the expression of a man who had learned to take Miss Marple's suggestions seriously, regardless of how seemingly trivial they might appear. "What sort of details, Miss Marple?" "Oh, nothing dramatic. But I've always found that people's daily activities leave small traces. A gentleman who works with books and papers might have ink stains, for instance." Dr. Haydock, who'd been conducting his preliminary examination with professional thoroughness, nodded thoughtfully. "Now that you mention it, there does appear to be some staining on the deceased shirt cuff. Green ink, I believe, though rather faded." "Green ink?" Miss Vale's voice rose slightly before she caught herself. "I mean to say, how unusual. Most people use blue or black ink for ordinary purposes." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed mildly. "Green ink is rather distinctive, isn't it? One might almost say specialized." The conversation was interrupted by Julian Hazelig, who had been examining Rare Book's case with a sort of intense focus that suggested professional interest rather than casual browsing. "I say, Inspector, about this Kelmscott Chaucer that's mentioned in the ledger. It's quite a valuable piece, you know, the sort of thing that would require very careful authentication before any transaction." "Valuable how?" Slack asked. "Well, a genuine. Kelmscott Chaucer could be worth several hundred to the right collector, possibly more, depending on condition and provenance. Mrs. Page gasped audibly. Several hundred for a single book. Oh yes, Hazelrig continued with the enthusiasm of an expert discussing his specialty. William Morris's Kelmscott Press produced some of the finest examples of book arts in the Victorian era. Collectors pay handsomely for authenticated examples. Miss Marple noted that this information seemed to affect different members of the company in different ways. Mrs. Page looked rather pale, as if contemplating what such valuations might mean for her own transaction with Mr. Fow. Miss Vale had become, if possible, even more rigid in her posture. Edwin Pratt was wringing his hands with increasing distress. The thing is, Hazelrig added almost casually, authentication can be quite tricky. There are some very clever forgeries in circulation, a less scrupulous dealer might easily be taken in. Are you suggesting that Mr. Fow might have been deceived? Dr. Haydock asked. Oh, quite the contrary. Fow had an excellent eye for authenticity. If anything, he was perhaps too careful, too thorough in his examinations, the sort of man who would spot a forgery where others might be fooled. Miss Marple filed this assessment away with all the other details that were beginning to form a pattern in her mind, a man too careful to be easily deceived. Ledgers with mysterious alterations, green ink stains, library withdrawals marked on approval, and somewhere in the middle of it all, a murder that had been very carefully staged to appear as if it had happened at a different time than when it actually occurred. The gramophone, with its positioned record, was beginning to make more sense, though the complete picture remained frustratingly elusive. As Inspector Slack continued his examination of the ledgers, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, confident that patience and observation would eventually reveal all the answers she needed. Chapter 5. Green Stamp. The Chapter 5. Green Stamp following morning found Miss Marple making what might have appeared to be a casual visit to the St. Mary Mead Public Library. In truth, her visit was anything but casual, though she maintained the gentle demeanor of someone simply returning an overdue volume of garden poetry. "Good morning, Miss Vale," she said pleasantly to the stern-faced woman behind the circulation desk. "I do hope I'm not too late with this. The roses have been particularly demanding this season." Millicent Vale looked up from her cataloging work with the expression of someone who found the world perpetually disappointing. "Late returns are a serious matter, Miss Marple. The library system depends upon proper adherence to schedules." "Of course, dear, I quite understand." Miss Marple placed her book on the counter and watched with interest as Miss Vale reached for the dating stamp. The ink pad, she noted, contained a most unusual shade of green ink, quite distinctive from the ordinary blue blackest in most establishments. "Interesting color," Miss Marple observed mildly. "Rather artistic." "The committee selected it specifically," Miss Vale replied with evident pride. "We felt that green suggested growth and learning. It's a special aniline-based ink, quite modern." Miss Marple nodded approvingly, though her keen eyes had noted something curious about the ink's behavior. As Miss Vale stamped their turn date with perhaps unnecessary force, a small amount of the green ink seemed to transfer to her fingertips. When she absent-mindedly touched her lips, the ink appeared to smear to a bluish shadow. "How fascinating. It seems to change color when moistened." "The peculiarity of the chemical composition, I believe," Miss Vale said, though she seemed less than pleased that Miss Marple had noticed this detail. She moved to wash her hands at the small sink behind the desk, scrubbing with the vigor of someone attempting to remove more than simple ink stains. Miss Marple accepted her returned book and made her way slowly through the library's modest collection, noting the careful organization and the small placard that proclaimed Millicent Vale, chief librarian and committee chair, in precise lettering. It was clear that Miss Vale took considerable pride in her domain and would be unlikely to tolerate any irregularities in its operation. An hour later, Miss Marple found herself back at Fow & Son, where Inspector Slack was continuing his investigation with methodical thoroughness. The shop remained closed to regular customers, though Edwin Pratt had been allowed Totten to basic maintenance under police supervision. "Inspector," she said quietly, approaching with a small handkerchief dampened from the morning's light rain, "I wonder if I might conduct a small experiment." Slack looked up from his examination of the crime scene with the weary expression of a man who had learned that Miss Marple's experiments, however odd they might seem, often yielded useful results. "What sort of experiment, Miss Marple?" "Something to do with ink, I believe." She moved to the green baize curtain that still hung precisely as it had the day before, its fresh linen tape bowen marred by the previous day's drama. With careful deliberation, she dabbed the damp handkerchief against the hem of the heavy fabric. The result was immediate and illuminating. Where the damp cloth touched the curtain, a faint green stain became visible, spreading slightly as the moisture activated whatever substance had been transferred to the fabric. More significantly, the green quickly shifted to the same bluish shadow that Miss Marple had observed on Miss Vale's lips. "Most interesting," she murmured. "The same peculiar ink that the library uses for their dating stamp." Edwin Pratt, who had been dusting shelves with mechanical precision, paused in his work. "Green ink? But Mr. Fow never used green ink, said it. Wasn't professional for business correspondence." Yet somehow this particular green ink found its way onto the curtain hem. Miss Marple examined the stained fabric more closely, and if I'm not mistaken, onto Mr. Fow's shirt cuff as well. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. Dr. Haydock did mention green ink staining on the deceased's clothing, said it was rather faded, as if it had been there for some time, or as if it had been transferred during some sort of interaction, Miss Marple suggested delicately. The implications of this discovery were interrupted by the arrival of several members of the previous day's gathering, drawn perhaps by curiosity or by Inspector Slack's summons for additional questioning. Julian Hazelig appeared first, followed shortly by Mrs. Page, who looked as if she had spent a sleepless night. "Any progress, Inspector?" Hazelig inquired, with the casual interest of someone whose own conscience was clear. "Some interesting developments," Slack replied without elaborating. "Miss Marple has been helping with certain technical aspects of the investigation." Mrs. Page approached the counter, where the two ledgers still lay open to their revealing entries. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, Inspector, about the discrepancy in the amounts recorded." "Oh, well, it's possible that I was mistaken about the exact sum. It was rather an emotional time disposing of my dear husband's books. Perhaps Mr. Fow did pay me 3 rather than 30 shillings. Miss Marple noted this sudden revision of the memory with interest. In her experience, people rarely became confused about money, particularly when the difference was as significant as 30 shillings. "Most generous of you to consider, Mrs. Page," she said gently, "though I wonder what might have prompted such a re-examination of your recollection." Mrs. Page's cheeks colored slightly. "I simply want to be fair to Mr. Fow's memory. He was always an honest dealer." "Indeed, he was." Miss Vale's voice came from the doorway where she had appeared with the silent efficiency of someone well practiced in library movement. "I felt I should stop by to see if there was any way the library committee might assist with your investigation, Inspector." Miss Marple observed Miss Vale's entrance with particular attention. The woman's hands, she noted, showed signs of recent and thorough washing, though traces of green still lingered around the fingernails. More interesting still was the way Miss Vale's eyes immediately went to the baize curtain, as if checking whether something remained as she'd left it. "Actually, Miss Vale, your timing is quite fortunate," Inspector Slack said. "I wanted to ask you about these library transactions recorded in Mr. Fow's private ledger. I'm sure I've told you everything relevant, Inspector, perhaps, but I'm curious about the authentication process for valuable items. How exactly does the library committee determine whether a book is genuine?" Miss Vale's posture became, if possible, even more rigid. "We rely upon expert opinion, naturally. Mr. Fow was considered quite knowledgeable about such matters. and if Mr. Fow had concerns about a particular item's authenticity, then those concerns would be taken seriously. Of course, the committee has no interest in acquiring questionable materials. Miss Marple had been watching this exchange with the attention of someone following a particularly complex knitting pattern. The words being spoken seemed straightforward enough, but the undercurrent suggested a far more complicated story. "Miss Vale," she said quietly, "yesterday you mentioned that library withdrawals were committee matters. Might I ask whether Mr. Fow had recently questioned any particular withdrawal?" The silence that followed this question seemed to stretch far longer than was comfortable. Miss Vale's fingers moved unconsciously to her lips, where a faint trace of bluish staining suggested recent contact with the library's distinctive green ink. "Mr. Fow," she said finally, "had raised certain questions about some of our procedures. Questions that I felt were inappropriate given his position as a dealer rather than a committee member." "What sort of questions?" Slack pressed. He seemed to feel that our authentication methods were insufficient. He wanted to examine items that had already been properly processed according to committee procedures. Miss Marple found this answer illuminating in what it didn't say as much as what it did. A man like Ambrose Fow, with his reputation for meticulous accuracy, would not question library procedures without good reason. As the morning progressed and more details emerged, Miss Marple began to see the outlines of a story that was considerably more complex than a simple robbery gone wrong. The green ink, the modified ledgers, the gramophone positioned just so, all suggested a careful plan that had been weeks, perhaps months in the making. But the most telling detail of all remained the look of barely concealed panic in Miss Vale's eyes whenever the conversation turned to questions of authenticity and proper procedures. Chapter 6. Thread on Hem. Miss Marple had always found that Chapter 6, Thread on Hem, the most revealing clues were often the ones that required one to get down on one's hands and knees, much like searching for a lost button or examining the underside of a carpet for wear patterns. It was with this philosophy in mind that she found herself kneeling beside the green baize curtain while Inspector Slack conducted his interviews in the front of the shop. The heavy fabric hung in perfect folds, each crease precisely arranged as if by someone with theatrical experience. But it was at the very bottom, where curtain met floor, that Miss Marple's patient examination yielded its reward. Caught in the hem, almost invisible unless one looked directly for it, was a strand of what appeared to be fishing line. "How very interesting," she murmured, carefully extracting the clear monofilament with her knitting needles. The thread was perhaps 18 in long, cut cleanly at both ends, and possessed of the sort of strength that would make it ideal for purposes beyond its intended use. The discovery prompted Miss Marple to trace the curtain's entire perimeter with methodical care. Near the top, where the fabric was secured to its rod, she found evidence of similar thread, though this piece showed signs of having been recently removed. Small impressions in the heavy baize suggested that something had been tied and untied with considerable precision. But it was when she turned her attention to the shop's door mechanism that the true ingenuity of the arrangement became clear. The same type of monofilament that she had found in the curtain hem was wound around the bell's spring fork, accounting for the muffled chime that had caught her attention the previous afternoon. More significantly, careful examination revealed that this thread continued beyond the bell mechanism, running along the doorframe and disappearing behind a stack of books near the entrance. Following its path with the determination of someone unraveling a particularly complex knitting error, Miss Marple discovered that the thread ran the entire length of the shop. "Edwin," she called quietly to the distressed assistant, who was mechanically dusting the same shelf for the third time that morning. "Might I ask you something about the gramophone?" Edwin approached with the nervous manner of someone who had not slept well. "The gramophone, Miss Marple. I've told the inspector everything I know. Mr. Fow didn't care for music during business hours." "Oh, I'm sure you have, dear. But I'm curious about something rather technical. She gestured toward the back room where the machine was still visible, through the gap in the curtain. That brake lever appears to have had something attached to it recently. Edwin peered in the direction she indicated, his face growing even paler. I hadn't noticed anything like that. No, of course not. It's the sort of detail one wouldn't notice unless one was looking specifically for it. Miss Marple's tone was gentle, almost conversational. Rather, like this thread that seems to run from the door all the way to the gramophone. Quite ingenious, really. The implications of this discovery were not lost on Edwin, whose hands began to shake visibly. Thread. I don't understand what you mean. Oh, I think you understand perfectly well, Miss Marple said kindly. You see, someone has arranged things so that opening the front door would release the gramophone's brake and start the record playing. At the same time, the thread would muffle the doorbell, ensuring that no one would hear the customer's arrival. Inspector Slack, who had been observing this demonstration with growing interest, approached with his notebook ready. Are you saying someone rigged the gramophone to play automatically? Precisely. And if one positioned their cord at exactly the right spot, one could ensure that a particular phrase would play at the moment the door opened. Miss Marple moved to examine the gramophone more closely. The record label shows Edwin's handwriting. Coral Lane Side A. Miss Lane, who had been listening, with professional fascination, stepped forward. But my recording is just a reading from my latest novel. There's no voice that sounds like Mr. Fow. No, Miss Marple agreed. But if someone had access to other recordings, perhaps from the Radio Club's Christmas programs that Mr. Fow participated in, they might have found exactly the phrase they needed. Edwin's face had gone from pale to ashen. This is all quite impossible. I don't know anything about gramophone mechanisms or threads, but you do know about records, don't you? Edwin? Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, but there was steel beneath the kindness. Someone has very carefully edited this recording. The label has been trimmed and repasted, and if I'm not mistaken, the beginning of the record has been altered to include a different voice entirely. Inspector Slack examined the record more closely, noting the subtle signs of tampering that Miss Marple had identified. So, you're suggesting that someone created a false recording to make it appear that Fow was alive when he was already dead? More than that, Miss Marple said. They created an entire mechanical system to ensure that the recording would play at precisely the right moment when they could be certain that witnesses would hear it. The ingenuity of the scheme was becoming clear to everyone present. A thread system that would start the gramophone when someone opened the door. A muffled bell to prevent the arrival from being noticed. A carefully edited recording that would play exactly the phrase needed to establish an alibi, but how would have the technical knowledge for such an arrangement? Dr. Haydock asked. Miss Marple smiled. Oh, I don't think it required very sophisticated knowledge. Just patience, careful observation, and access to the necessary materials. The sort of things that might be available to someone who had worked in the shop for many years and understood its routines perfectly. Edwin Pratt's shoulders sagged as the weight of accusation settled upon him. You don't understand, he said quietly. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was never supposed to. Go so far, but it did go that far, didn't it? Inspector Slack said grimly. And now a man is dead. As Edwin began his confession, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the careful preparation that had gone into the crime. The threads and mechanisms spoke of someone who had planned meticulously, who had thought through every detail of timing and execution. Yet for all the ingenuity of the mechanical arrangements, the human element had proven far more complex than the perpetrator had anticipated. The green ink that had betrayed other secrets, the ledgers that told their own story of deception, the witnesses who'd noticed more than they were supposed to see. The thread on the hem had been just the beginning of unraveling a web of deceit that stretched far beyond a simple case of theft or passion. As Edwin's story emerged, Miss Marple suspected that they were about to discover that the murder of Ambrose Fow was merely the final act in a drama that had been playing out for months. Chapter 7. Midnight Switch. Edwin Pratt's. Chapter 7. Midnight Switch confession had been rather less illuminating than Inspector Slack had hoped. While the young man had readily admitted to arranging the mechanical contrivance with the gramophone and thread, his story of the actual murder remained frustratingly vague. He claimed to have found Mr. Fow already dead when he arrived that morning, and had panicked into creating the elaborate deception to avoid suspicion. "It doesn't make sense," Slack confided to Miss Marple as they stood outside the sealed bookshop in the gathering dusk. "Why go to such elaborate lengths to create a false alibi if you're innocent of the actual crime?" "Perhaps," Miss Marple suggested, gently, because Mr. Pratt suspected who the real murderer was, and felt the need to protect them. Protect them? But why would he do such a thing? Miss Marple considered this question as they walked slowly down the high street. Loyalty takes many forms, Inspector. Sometimes people protect others, not because they approve of what they've done, but because they understand why they felt compelled to do it. It was this conversation that led to Miss Marple's suggestion for what should delicately termed a vigil. If Edwin had been protecting someone, and if that someone felt that evidence remained in the shop that might prove damaging, they might very well attempt to retrieve it under cover of darkness. Sergeant Lake had been somewhat skeptical of the plan, but Inspector Slack's respect for Miss Marple's insights had grown considerably over the years. By 11 a.m. that evening, they had positioned themselves in the shadow doorway of the haberdashery across from Fow and Son, prepared for what might prove to be a long and fruitless wait. The high street at midnight possessed an entirely different character from its daytime bustle. The familiar shops took on mysterious aspects in the moonlight, and every shadow seemed to hold potential significance. Miss Marple had brought her knitting, finding that the gentle clicking of needles helped to pass the time while keeping her hands occupied. "Bit chilly for a summer night," Sergeant Lake whispered, though Miss Marple suspected his nervousness had more to do with the unusual nature of their surveillance than with the temperature. "Patience, Sergeant," she replied softly. "If I'm correct about this matter, our wait shouldn't be too much longer." Her prediction proved accurate. Shortly before midnight, a figure appeared at the far end of the high street, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who wished to avoid notice. The person carried what appeared to be a small parcel and approached Fow and Son with obvious familiarity with the building's layout. "Well, I'll be," Sergeant Lake breathed as the figure produced a key and unlocked the shop door with practiced efficiency. The person who entered was Millicent Vale, and she moved through the darkened shop with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where everything was located. Through the window, they could see her making her way directly toward the back room, her parcel clutched tightly in her hands. "Now," Sergeant Lake whispered. "Give her a moment," Miss Marple advised. "Let her reveal her purpose fully." They watched as Miss Vale moved about the back room, clearly searching for something specific. She opened the parcel she had brought, removing several items that she arranged on the valuation table with methodical precision. "Now," Miss Marple said quietly. Sergeant Lake crossed the street with admirable stealth and entered the shop through the unlocked door. His police training served him well as he approached the back room without alerting its occupant to his presence. "Miss Vale," he said calmly, "I'll have to ask you to step away from that table." The scream that followed was less one of surprise than of frustration. The sound of someone whose carefully laid plans had been unexpectedly thwarted. Miss Vale spun around, her face pale in the lamplight, the contents of her parcel scattered across the table before her. "Sergeant Lake, what are you doing here?" I was simply what, Miss Vale?" Inspector Slack had appeared in the doorway, with Miss Marple close behind him. The items Miss Vale had brought were revealing in their specificity. A spare record sleeve, several lengths of bookbinder's linen tape identical to that used on the curtain, and most significantly, a single-edged razor with traces of paste still clinging to its blade. "I came to rescue committee property, Miss Vale," said stiffly, attempting to regain her composure. "The Kelmscott Chaucer belongs to the library, and I felt it shouldn't remain here under these circumstances." Inspector Slack glanced toward the glass case where the valuable volume still rested, exactly as it had been left the previous day. "The Chaucer appears to be undisturbed, Miss Vale. What exactly were you planning to rescue?" Miss Vale's eyes darted toward the glass case, and Miss Marple noted a momentary expression of confusion across her features. I wanted to ensure its safety." "How thoughtful," Miss Marple said gently, "though I notice you've brought some rather interesting tools for a simple retrieval mission." The razor with its paste residue was particularly damning evidence, as was the fresh linen tape that matched the curtain's new bow exactly, but it was when Miss Marple examined the glass case itself that the final piece of the puzzle became clear. "Inspector," she said, pointing to a small smear on the glass surface. "Do you see this mark here? It appears to be French-Polish, and it's positioned exactly where a label might have been removed and reattached." Miss Vale's face went from pale to gray. "I don't know what you're suggesting." "I'm suggesting," Miss Marple said calmly, "that someone has been very busy switching labels, editing records, and generally rearranging evidence to cover their tracks. The question is, what were they trying to hide?" Inspector Slack examined the glass case more closely, noting the smear that Miss Marple had identified. "Are you saying the Chaucer in this case isn't genuine?" "Oh, I suspect it's genuine enough," Miss Marple replied. "But I also suspect it isn't the same volume that was originally withdrawn from the library. Someone has been conducting a rather profitable switching operation, and Mr. Fow had discovered the deception. The implications of this revelation settled over Miss Vale like a heavy cloak. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of exposure pressed down upon her. "You don't understand," she said finally. "The library's budget is practically non-existent. We can barely afford basic maintenance, let alone new acquisitions. When I realized that some of our older volumes had significant value, it seemed only reasonable to make the most of our resources." "By selling genuine items and replacing them with forgeries," Slack asked, "by ensuring that the library's needs were met through whatever means available," Miss Vale corrected with a return of her characteristic severity. "The volumes were just sitting there unappreciated, while we struggled to keep the doors open." Miss Marple found this justification sadly familiar. In her experience, people who convinced themselves that theft was merely efficient resource management often found it surprisingly easy to escalate to more serious crimes when their schemes were threatened. "And when Mr. Fow discovered your system," she prompted gently. Miss Vale's composure finally cracked entirely. "He was going to ruin everything. All my work, all the careful planning. He couldn't see the larger picture, couldn't understand that. Sometimes one must bend the rules for the greater good." The midnight switch had revealed far more than Miss Vale had intended. But Miss Marple suspected that the complete truth was still to come. The razor, the paste, the carefully prepared materials, all suggested that this evening's mission had been about more than simple evidence retrieval. As Inspector Slack placed Miss Vale under arrest, Miss Marple reflected on the sad irony of a librarian who had tried to save her institution through its destruction, and an assistant who had tried to protect a murderer through his own confession to lesser crimes. The truth, as always, had proven more complex than anyone had initially imagined. Morning following Miss Vale's arrest found Miss Marple engaged in what appeared to be a most mundane activity, examining the contents of the dustbin behind Fow and Son. Inspector Slack had initially been reluctant to authorize such an undignified search, But Miss Marple's previous insights had earned her considerable latitude in her investigative methods. "Really, Miss Marple?" Dr. Haydock observed as he joined her in the narrow alley. "Surely the police have more conventional ways of gathering evidence." "Oh, I'm sure they do," she replied pleasantly, carefully extracting a handful of charred paper, fragments from among the ashes. "But I've always found that people are most careless with the things they believe no one will ever examine." The fragments she had discovered were scorched but not entirely destroyed, and patient examination revealed them to be the remnants of book spines that had been systematically burned. More intriguingly, several pieces showed traces of what appeared to be bookplate designs, though these had been traced rather than printed in the traditional manner. "Transfer paper," she murmured, holding up a corner of translucent material that had survived the flames. "Someone has been manufacturing bookplates." Inspector Slack, who had arrived with a grim expression of a man who had spent the night dealing with a suspect who alternated between defiant justification and tearful confession, examined the burnt remnants with interest. "Bookplates? You mean those little labels that show ownership?" "Precisely, and very important they are, too, for establishing provenance. A book's value can depend greatly upon its documented history of ownership." Miss Marple continued her careful excavation of the ashes, but if someone were creating false bookplates, they could significantly alter a volume's apparent pedigree. Dr. Haydock had been conducting his own examination of the alley, and his medical training had led him to investigate the small grate that served the shop's heating system. "Miss Marple, you might find this interesting as well." In the cold ashes of the grate, he had discovered additional evidence of recent burning. A sliver of shellac, the sortest in French polishing fine furniture and bookbindings, had partially survived the flames. More significantly, he had found a corner of what was unmistakably a gramophone record label, trimmed with obvious care and bearing traces of paste. "So our murderer has been busy with more than just bookplates," Inspector Slack observed grimly. "They've been altering gramophone records as well." Miss Marple studied the record label fragment with the attention she might give to a particularly complex knitting pattern. "This confirms what we suspected about the edited recording. Someone took considerable care to create exactly the right phrase at exactly the right moment." "But why go to such elaborate lengths?" Dr. Haydock asked. "Surely there were simpler ways to establish an alibi." But you see, this wasn't just about creating an alibi," Miss Marple explained patiently. "This was about creating a very specific kind of confusion. The mechanical arrangement with the gramophone ensured that multiple witnesses would hear what they believed to be Mr. Fow's voice at a time when he was already dead. But more importantly, it directed suspicion away from the real killer and toward poor Edwin, who had arrived to find the body and panicked into creating his own deception." The picture that emerged from the burnt evidence was one of meticulous preparation spanning weeks, or possibly months. Someone had been carefully creating false documentation, altering records, and preparing the mechanical means for an elaborate deception. The sheer scope of the preparation suggested this was far from a crime of passion. Inspector Slack consulted his notes from the previous evening's interrogation. "Miss Vale has admitted to the book-switching operation, but she maintains that she found Fow already dead when she arrived at the shop Saturday morning. And what time does she claim to have arrived?" "Early, she says, before the shop was due to open. She had come to discuss the authentication questions Fow had raised about the Chaucer." Miss Marple found this timeline interesting. "So we have Miss Vale arriving early, finding Mr. Fow dead, and then what?" "According to her story, she panicked and left immediately, claimed she spent the rest of the morning at home working on library catalogs, and Edwin still maintains he arrived at his usual time, found the body, and created the gramophone deception to avoid suspicion falling on Miss Vale, whom he suspected of the crime." Dr. Haydock had continued his examination of the burnt remains and made another discovery among the ashes. "There's something else here." Looks like the remnants of official documentation. Library stamps, perhaps? Or withdrawal forms. The fragments he had found bore the distinctive green ink that Miss Marple had identified at the library, though the paper had been too damaged by fire to reveal specific content. However, the very fact that official library documents had been burned suggested an attempt to destroy evidence of the switching operation. Most thorough, Miss Marple observed, someone wanted to ensure that no trace remained of their activities, but it was her final discovery in the dustbin that proved most illuminating. Buried beneath layers of ordinary shop refuse, she found a small glass vial that had once contained shellac polish. The vial bore a partial label indicating it was of the type used by professional bookbinders for restoration work. French polish, she said, holding the vial up to the light. Exactly what one would use to age the appearance of a new bookplate or binding. Inspector Slack was beginning to see the scope of the deception they were uncovering. So someone was not only switching valuable books for worthless ones, but also creating elaborate documentation to support the forgeries. Indeed. And when Mr. Fow's expertise threatened to expose the entire operation, Miss Marple let the implication hang in the air. The burnt spines and destroyed records painted a picture of desperate attempts to cover tracks that were already well established. But Miss Marple found herself troubled by the timeline that was emerging from the various confessions and testimonies. Dr. Haydock had by now completed his more detailed examination of Mr. Fow's body, and his findings added another layer of complexity to the case. "I can now be more precise about the time of death," he announced. "Based on the body's condition and the ambient temperature in the back room, I estimate that Fow died at least 15 minutes before the author tea began, possibly as much as half an hour earlier." This revelation cast both Edwin's and Miss Vale's stories in an entirely new light. If Mr. Fow had been dead for half an hour before the gathering began, then whoever killed him had left the body in place while calmly attending a social function with the deceased's customers and friends. "The cold-bloodedness of it," Dr. Haydock murmured, "to sit there drinking tea and discussing literature while knowing that a man lay dead just behind that curtain." Miss Marple nodded gravely. The burnt evidence had revealed the careful preparation behind the crime, but Dr. Haydock's refined timeline revealed something perhaps even more chilling: the killer's ability to maintain perfect composure while surrounded by potential witnesses. As they concluded their examination of the alley, Miss Marple reflected on how the destroyed evidence had paradoxically provided some of the clearest insights into the crime. The very thoroughness of the attempt to eliminate traces had revealed the scope and sophistication of the deception. But one question remained tantalizingly unanswered. If both Edwin and Miss Vale had arrived to find Mr. Fow already dead, who had actually committed the murder? Chapter 9. Wrong Chapter 9. Wrong record. Miss Marple sat in her garden that evening, her knitting needles clicking with the rhythm of someone whose hands worked automatically, while her mind pursued more complex patterns. The threads of the Fow case had been carefully gathered, and now it was time to weave them into their proper design. The difficulty, she said to herself, is that everyone has been telling part of the truth, but not quite the whole truth. The next morning found her once again at Fow & Son, where Inspector Slack was conducting what he hoped would be his final review of the evidence. Edwin Pratt sat in nervous attendance, while Miss Vale remained in custody, pending further charges. "Let me see if I understand the sequence of events correctly," Miss Marple began in her gentle way. Miss Vale had been operating a book-switching scheme for some months, replacing valuable library volumes with sophisticated forgeries and selling the originals through private channels. Inspector Slack consulted his notes. That much he's admitted to. Says it started small, just a few items here and there to help the library's finances. But Mr. Fow discovered the deception. Eventually, yes. His expert eye spotted discrepancies that a casual observer might miss. The bookplate positioning on the Chaucer was slightly wrong, and one gathering showed machine-cut edges that a Victorian volume wouldn't have had. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. and when he threatened to expose the scheme, according to Miss Vale, she arranged to meet him early Saturday morning to discuss the matter. She claimed she hoped to convince him to overlook the irregularities for the greater good of the library, but instead she found him already dead. Or so she claims. Miss Marple considered this carefully. Yet we know from the burnt evidence that someone had been preparing for weeks to cover their tracks, the false book plates, the edited gramophone record, the mechanical arrangement with the thread. That level of preparation suggests premeditation, not panic. Edwin Pratt, who had been listening with growing distress, finally spoke up. "I've told you everything I know. I found Mr. Fow dead and created the gramophone trick to protect Miss Vale because I was certain she must have done it." "But why were you so certain, Edwin?" Miss Marple asked gently. Because I knew about the arguments they'd been having. Mr. Fow had discovered something about the library books, and he was very angry about it. He said people who betrayed trust deserved whatever consequences came to them. This revelation cast Miss Vale's story in a new light. But Miss Marple found herself focusing on a different aspect of the timeline. "Edwin, when exactly did you arrive at the shop Saturday morning?" "My usual time, miss. 7. Mr. Fow always liked to have the shop properly prepared before opening. And the author tea was scheduled to begin at what time? 2:15 in the afternoon. Miss Marple's needles paused in their clicking, so there was a gap of more than 6 hours between when you found the body and when the gathering began. "Yes, Miss I spent most of that time trying to work up the courage to call the police, and then I thought about Miss Vale and what would happen to her, and I decided to try to protect her instead." Inspector Slack leaned forward with interest. "You spent 6 hours in the shop with a dead body. I stayed in the front room mostly. I couldn't bear to look at Mr. Fow again." Miss Marple found this explanation troubling for several reasons. "Edwin, if you found Mr. Fow at 7 and Dr. Haydock estimates he died only 15 to 30 minutes before the tea began, that would mean he was killed around 1 at the earliest." The mathematics of the situation settled over Edwin like a cold wind. His face went pale as he realized the implication of Miss Marple's observation. "But that's impossible," he stammered. "I found him in the morning. He was cold when I touched him. Bodies can feel cold for many reasons," Dr. Haydock interjected quietly. "Temperature, shock, emotional response. Without proper medical examination, it would be easy to mistake unconsciousness for death." The possibility that Edwin had discovered, Mr. Fow unconscious rather than dead, opened entirely new avenues of investigation. Miss Marple pursued this line of thought with a persistence of someone untangling a particularly stubborn knot. "Edwin, when you found Mr. Fow, was he lying exactly as we discovered him on Saturday afternoon?" Well, not exactly. He was on the floor, but he seemed to have fallen differently. I thought perhaps I should make him more comfortable, so I moved him a little in the stool with a book-shaped doorstop. Edwin's hands began to shake. That was on the floor, too. I put it back where it belonged. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. If Edwin had rearranged the crime scene, it suggested that what they had found on Saturday afternoon might not represent the actual circumstances of the attack. "Edwin," she said very gently, "I think you need to tell us exactly what happened when you arrived at the shop that morning." The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more tragic than anyone had imagined. Edwin had indeed found Mr. Fow unconscious from a blow to the head, but very much alive. In his panic and inexperience, he had assumed the worst, and spent the morning in an agony of indecision about what to do. "He was breathing," Edwin admitted finally. "But he looked so pale and there was blood and I thought he was dying. And there was nothing I could do to help him." "So what did you do?" Inspector Slack asked, though Miss Marple suspected she already knew the answer. I left him there. I was too frightened to call for help, too ashamed to admit what I'd found. I kept thinking Miss Vale would come back and explain everything, or that Mr. Fow would wake up and be all right. But he didn't wake up. When I checked on him again around noon, he had stopped breathing. That's when I realized I had to do something. To protect Miss Vale because I was sure she would be blamed. The wrong record had been Edwin's panicked attempt to create a timeline that would clear Miss Vale of suspicion. But his well-meaning deception had obscured the real tragedy. Ambrose Fow had died not from the initial blow, but from lack of medical attention. That might have saved his life. Miss Marple felt the familiar sadness that accompanied the resolution of such cases. The crime had been terrible enough, but the cover-up had transformed what might have been assault into murder and had destroyed 2 additional lives in the process. So Miss Vale struck him in anger during their confrontation, Inspector Slack concluded grimly, and Edwin's misguided loyalty turned her assault into a capital crime. But Miss Marple found herself troubled by one final detail. In all the confessions and revelations, no one had yet explained who had prepared the elaborate gramophone mechanism, an edited recording that had so cleverly misdirected their investigation. The wrong record, she realized, was not just Edwin's well-meaning deception, but a far more sophisticated scheme that someone else had orchestrated entirely. Chapter 10. Curtain Call. Chapter 10. Curtain Call. The morning sun streamed through the eye. Windows of Fow and Son as Miss Marple arranged the chairs in a neat semicircle facing the counter. Inspector Slack had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to her suggestion for a final gathering of all the principals in the case. Sometimes she had explained the truth emerged most clearly when all the players were present to hear their roles described. Lady Bantry arrived first, followed closely by the Reverend and Mrs. Clement. Dr. Haydock took his customary position near the window, while Miss Coral Lane settled herself with the alert attention of someone eager to see how a real-life mystery concluded. Julian Hazelig appeared precisely on time, his London polish somewhat dimmed by recent events. Mrs. Page entered, hesitantly, still troubled by their revelations about her husband's books. Edwin Pratt sat pale and nervous near the door, while Millicent Vale, released on bail pending trial, maintained her rigid posture despite the circumstances that had brought them all together. "Thank you all for coming," Miss Marple began in her gentle way. "I felt it important that we should understand exactly what happened in this shop, not just for the sake of justice, but so that we might all learn from the tragic events that have unfolded." Inspector Slack consulted his notebook. "The facts, as we now understand them, are these. Miss Vale conducted a systematic scheme to substitute valuable library books with forgeries, selling the originals for personal gain. When Mr. Fow discovered this deception, she struck him with the book-shaped doorstop, intending only to silence his objections temporarily. But Edwin's well-meaning but misguided attempts to protect her transformed what might have been assault into murder. Dr. Haydock added gravely, "Mr. Fow died from lack of medical attention that could have saved his life." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, that's all quite accurate as far as it goes, but I'm afraid it doesn't explain several important details that have been troubling me." She moved to the green baize curtain, still hanging with its precise linen tape bow. For instance, the mechanical arrangement that created our false alibi was far too sophisticated for someone acting in panic. The thread system connecting door to gramophone, the carefully edited recording, the muffled bell. These preparations required considerable time and technical knowledge. Edwin shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I have explained about the gramophone trick, Miss Marple. I thought it would help clear Miss Vale." "Oh, I'm sure you did create a gramophone trick, Edwin, but I don't believe it was the one we discovered." Miss Marple's eyes swept the assembled group. "You see, someone else had already prepared a far more elaborate deception, and your simple attempt to help Miss Vale actually interfered with their much more sophisticated plan." The room fell silent as the implications of this statement settled over the gathering. "Are you suggesting there was a third party involved?" Inspector Slack asked. Not a third party, exactly. Rather someone who was present at our author tea, someone who had carefully orchestrated events to ensure they would have witnesses to their innocence at precisely the right moment. Miss Marple moved to examine the glass case containing the Kelmscott. Chaucer. The key to understanding this crime lies not in passion or panic, but in careful, methodical planning. Someone discovered Miss Vale's book-switching operation and saw an opportunity to use it for their own purposes. She turned to face Julian Hazeligg directly. "You've been very patient, Mr. Hazeligg, waiting for us to uncover Miss Vale's relatively simple fraud, while your much more complex scheme remained hidden." Hazeligg's urban composure flickered for just a moment before reasserting itself. "I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. I'm merely a dealer who expressed interest in purchasing a valuable volume." "Oh, but you're much more than that. You're someone who recognized that Miss Vale's amateur efforts at forgery could be refined and expanded into a much more profitable enterprise. The burnt book plates, the transfer paper, the professional quality French polish, these were the tools of someone with considerably more expertise than our librarian possessed." Miss Marple moved to the gramophone, still positioned exactly as they had found it. "You prepared this elaborate mechanical deception not to protect Miss Vale, but to ensure that you would have an unshakable alibi for the time of Mr. Fow's death. The thread system, the edited recording containing Mr. Fow's voice from his radio club appearance, the precise timing that would make everyone hear him speak when he was already dead. But the plan went wrong because Edwin discovered the body hours before you expected anyone to find it. His simple panic and rearrangement of the scene disrupted your carefully orchestrated timeline. Inspector Slack was beginning to see the larger picture. So Hazeligg killed to prevent exposure of an expanded forgery operation. More than that, Miss Marple replied, "I believe Mr. Hazeligg discovered that he could use Miss Vale's desperate situation to his advantage. He offered to help her cover her tracks, but only if she would provide him with a steady supply of valuable volumes that he could replace with superior forgeries." Mrs. Page gasped audibly. "My husband's books. The discrepancy in the payment. Exactly." Mr. Hazeligg was already testing his system, using Miss Vale's position to acquire valuable items at far below their true worth, then replacing them with forgeries before sale to unsuspecting collectors. Miss Marple's voice grew stern, but when Mr. Fow's expertise threatened to expose not just Miss Vale's amateur efforts, but the entire expanded operation, more drastic measures became necessary. Hazeligg's mask of sophistication was finally slipping. "This is all speculation, Miss Marple. You have no proof of any expanded operational conspiracy, don't I?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "Inspector Slack, perhaps you could tell us what your colleagues discovered when they searched Mr. Hazeligg's London premises." Slack consulted a telegram that had arrived that morning. Extensive forgery equipment, including a complete bookbinding setup, and materials for aging paper and leather. Also, correspondence with several European dealers regarding volumes that match items recorded in Fow's private ledger. The evidence was overwhelming, but Miss Marple had one final revelation. The most damning proof, however, lies in the timing itself. You see, Mr. Hazeligg, your gramophone mechanism was designed to create the illusion that Mr. Fow was alive at 2:15, when the first guest opened the door. But Edwin's discovery of the body and his simple rearrangement meant that when your elaborate scheme finally activated, it merely confirmed what we had already observed, that something was very wrong with the timeline we were being asked to accept. As Inspector Slack moved to arrest Hazeligg, Lady Bantry shivered and glanced once more at the green baize curtain. Curtains do make a stage of anything, don't they? Miss Marple moved to the curtain and carefully extracted the last piece of monofilament from its hem. "Yes, Dolly. People forget that shops are little theaters, and a theater always tells on the actor who tries to cue the wrong line." The case was closed, but Miss Marple reflected sadly on how greed and desperation had transformed a simple bookshop into a stage for tragedy. In the end, It had been the very sophistication of the deception that had revealed its true author. Edwin would face charges for his failure to seek medical help, but his obvious remorse and the circumstances would likely earn him leniency. Miss Vale's fate would be determined by the courts, though her cooperation in exposing Hazelig's larger scheme might serve her well. As for Julian Hazelig, his curtain call had come at last, and the audience had not been impressed by his performance.